Welcome to session 9 and the last session of this course on customer value management. In the previous sessions where we talked about pricing, we talked about all different aspects on pricing, how you can estimate and measure willingness to pay and economic value creation, how consumers perceive prices, how different constraints like cost or competition work on prices. And today I want to focus on the temporal effect of pricing. What happens to prices and how should they be adjusted in the very short term, which is usually referred to under the term yield management, and in the much longer term over the entire life cycle, so life cycle pricing. Let's start first with yield management. Yield management is a dynamic revenue maximization technique that constantly tries to predict demand and supply and match both in order to determine the optimal price for a product. So imagine that every single day you try to predict for the next 365 days in advance what the demand for a certain product is, what the supply could be, and then you determine the optimal price based on comparing demand and supply. Now, yield management is mostly used and it makes sense when there is a limited and fixed capacity. You may, for example, know yield management out of the context of airlines, where it has actually first been invented. Airline companies have a limited fixed capacity, because a flight that leaves on February 14 from Paris to New York has a certain number of seats. And this number of seats can usually not be changed very easily in the short term. Some service capacity is booked and sold in advance, but may be canceled last minutes. Tickets for flights are usually sold days, weeks, or even months in advance, but occasionally people may either cancel if they can, or simply not show up. And products are perishable and cannot be stored. If a seat is not sold and the plane is taken off, the seat has no value anymore. You cannot take an empty seat from one plane and carry it over to the next plane. And when you have these three conditions, and imagine an airplane as the best example, limited capacity, this capacity is sold in advance, at least in part, and can be canceled, possibly last minute. And once the doors are closed, the empty seat can no longer be sold, so the products are perishable. You can use yield management. And yield management has three elements to it that we discuss now in more detail. One is called overbooking, one is called discount allocation, and one is traffic management. Let's start with the probably most famous one, which is overbooking. Assume you have an airline or a hotel or anything that has a fixed capacity where people might cancel and where at some point, if the room is not sold or the seat is not sold, the room or the seat have lost their value. You have a natural tendency to probably sell more seats than you actually have. Assume your plane has 200 seats. You know that on average, 10 people would not show up. So you would sell 210 seats instead of 200, knowing that 10 wouldn't come anyway and the plane would still be full, even if the people do not show up. In many service industries, you have the case that customers are allowed to cancel reservations, either with penalty or without penalty, or they may simply not show up. And if then the reserved capacity is not used, there may be either a resulting loss in revenue if customers can cancel without a penalty, or revenue that you could have earned on top by selling the seat essentially twice. And therefore, companies in these type of sectors, and this applies to hotels, to rental car companies, to airlines, they tend to sell more than they actually have. Now, of course, this becomes a financial calculation. So let's go in a quick example. Assume a hotel earns a contribution of $40 per occupied room. Now, assume the worst case, that actually you have sold 102 rooms out of the 100 you have, but everyone shows up. So there would be 2 guests who have a confirmed reservation, but they need to be sent away because you have overbooked. Assume such cost of overbooking are $100 because you have to transport the guest to a different hotel. You may need to pay a price difference for the possibly different hotel. And of course, there may be negative word of mouth. Well, still, even with that, it is pretty straightforward because you know the contribution margin per room, which is 40. You know the cost of sending away a guest, which is 10. And from past experience, you know the probability that you have of people not showing up. There's a 7% probability that everyone comes, and 19% probability that one person doesn't show up to a 1% probability that 9 people don't show up. And now you can simply fill out this matrix as a function of no-shows, and the number of reservations overbooked. Look at the first row to get an idea. With a 7% probability, everyone shows up. If you have not oversold any room, the cost is 0. But for every room that you have oversold, in this specific case, you would have cost of 100. So for one number of reservations overbooked, it's 100. For two, it's 200. If you have one no-show and you have not overbooked anything, the cost that you incur is 40. It is the lost revenue. If there's one no-show and one overbooking, there's cost of 0. And then again, we have the 100, 200, 300 that we had above. You fill out this matrix and then you weight each column with the probability of occurrence. So you take for the first column 7% times 0 plus 19% times 40 plus 22% times 80 and so on and so forth, which gives you the expected loss. And then you simply pick the column where the expected loss is lowest, which in our case would be 2. So given a contribution margin of 40, given a cost of sending a customer away of 100, and given the probabilities you have in the second column, we would overbook 2 rooms. Now, the next case that airlines deal with is discount allocation, because in many industries, the same or very similar products are sold at vastly different prices. I mean, look at a plane. There is first class, business class, premium economy, and economy. And in economy, all seats are essentially the same. However, that doesn't mean that people pay the same price. Some people may have purchased the seat at a much cheaper or much more expensive price than others. Same for hotels. There may be many, many comparable rooms, but that doesn't mean that everyone pays the same price, because airline tickets are sold what is called in different booking classes, related to certain constraints when the ticket is purchased, when it can be rebooked, and so on and so forth. Well, every single time when somebody wants to buy an airline ticket, the airline has to make a choice of either selling the seat at a cheaper price or keeping the seat for possible future sales at a higher price. If they sell the seat at a discounted price, they get the discounted fare. If they reject the discount request, they may get a higher fare or they may not get anything. And similar to the calculation we did on the overbooking, you can make a calculation in the discount allocation case to decide under which conditions and at which points in time you should accept prices at different ranges. This is, for example, the reason why airline prices can change quite dramatically if you look at the same destination and the same ticket 2 weeks ago, last week, and today. And finally, for the specific case of airlines, we have something called traffic management. Many airlines have a hub and spoke system. Air France, for example, has a hub in Paris. KLM has a hub in Amsterdam. Lufthansa has a hub in Frankfurt and in Munich. This means there is a certain incentive of transporting people to the hub, because when they are not at the hub, they cannot continue their journey elsewhere. Assume, for example, you have 2 customers. One customer who wants to fly from Lyon to New York, and another customer wants to fly from Paris to New York. Well, the customer from Lyon to New York first needs to go from Lyon to Paris, and then from Paris to New York. However, that part of the Lyon to Paris trip is an essential trip, because otherwise you will not earn the money on the Paris to New York trip. And this is why when you buy a complicated ticket, Lyon, Paris, New York, the Lyon to Paris route may be much cheaper and in any case differently priced than if you would simply buy a simple Lyon to Paris ticket. This is called traffic management. Now, yield management requires, as I said before, limited and fixed capacity of perishable items with a quite significant difference in willingness to pay. And there are many offline services where this applies to, and I gave you examples of hotel rooms, car rentals, train tickets, airline tickets. But you can also extend the idea of yield management to other cases. For example, you could use it for food items. And in a certain way, that's what companies do when they discount perishable products, like fresh fish, just before it gets perished. Or even for fashion companies, when sometimes they discount items when there are a certain amount of time at the shelf because they tend to go out of fashion. If you apply it in a more complicated, in a more extended way, you often also call it dynamic pricing, and there are several examples of dynamic pricing. Amazon, for example, updates its prices on average every 10 minutes, depending on data about competitors. Cintra, a Spanish infrastructure firm, adjusts road tolls determined on the current traffic on their roads in order to ensure that there's always an average speed of about 80 kilometers per hour. Kohl's US department store even uses, as you see on the slide, electronic tickets that can show prices that are only valid for some hours or probably for some days. And there's one company in Nebraska, the Nebraska Furniture Mart, to actually adapt its prices depending on how the product is currently sold at Amazon and Best Buy. The problem that you have with this dynamic adjustment of prices is that under certain conditions, consumers may perceive this to be unfair. Now, when a customer perceives a product and a pricing decision to be unfair or not is a rather complicated decision. And I put an article in the supplementary reading that deals with this in more detail. But essentially, the translation from a price comparison, that is realizing that two prices are different, and a perceived price fairness or unfairness, is a function of four different factors. The first factor is transaction similarity. Consumers are much more likely to accept that a student pays a different price for a cinema ticket than a working person, than two working persons that are totally similar having to pay different prices. So the more dissimilar the parties are, the more acceptable different prices tend to be. The distribution of costs and profit. Consumers have a higher tendency to accept differentiated prices when they do not have the impression that the company only does it in order to earn more money. For example, if a company would start charging 3 times the price for umbrellas in the moment where it starts to rain, this would be perceived as highly unfair because it's a pure profit objective. However, if the company can justifiably argue that some products are out of stock and therefore the prices have to go up, that would be perceived as more fair or as less unfair. A third factor is the buyer relationship stage and the trust. If you have interacted many, many times with the same seller as a buyer, and all these previous occasions things went well, you have a higher tendency to accept a slight anomaly without reacting with price unfairness perception. And finally, it depends on your general belief and social norms of how you think market partners interact in your specific environment. Now, under certain conditions, realizing different prices can lead to unfairness perceptions, and this can then trigger a whole range of negative emotions and, under certain conditions, even negative actions. You would want to avoid, under all conditions, price unfairness perceptions. And I give you 2 examples here. For example, when Uber increased prices 8-fold during snowstorms in 2013, there was a huge debate on Twitter about how unfair this is. And if you want to understand it a little bit more, how far and at which lengths consumers may go when they perceive a company treats them unfairly, I encourage you to watch this video of Tex Shetty, who bought a car, a Jeep Grand Cherokee for $60,000, who claims he had problems with it, and who in response produced an entire music video to explain his bad experience with the company. And these are cases you want to avoid because they can lead to massive negative word of mouth and quite significant PR damage.